Welcome to the Center for Baptist Leadership Podcast, hosted by William Wolfe. Our mission is to cultivate courageous and biblical Baptist leadership for the 21st century. We aim to revitalize the Southern Baptist Convention from within, defend it from those who seek its destruction, and serve as a better Baptist voice in the public square.
Welcome back to the Center for Baptist Leadership Podcast. I'm your host, Executive Director William Wolfe. Our first podcast is a two-part series, and this is the second episode. So if you haven't listened to the first one yet, let me encourage you to go do that. Our guest is still Jon Whitehead, who is on the advisory board of the CBL and serves as a trustee for the Southern Baptist Convention's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. So far, Jon and I have been talking about the never been told backstory of Russell Moore's departure from the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, his public, first private and then publicly leaked letters full of unsubstantiated allegations of a culture of abuse at the executive committee and more prevalent across all of the Southern Baptist Convention. Jon Whitehead, a trustee of the ERLC, has explained the backstory of these letters and how really they were launched as an act of retaliation against a simple request for some mission fidelity and mission correction at the ERLC. There was a February 2020 letter, then an end of May 2021 letter, leaked audio, and that brings us to the 2021 annual meeting of the Southern Baptist Convention, which at this point, the messengers there have been whipped into an emotional frenzy because of these outrageous allegations. And if you didn't know the true story, one can understand how that could be. So, Jon, let's pick up at the 2021 convention. Let's talk about the motions that were made there that set investigations into motion. And then we'll move into the fall meeting of the executive committee later that year, and we'll move on to where we are in this present day.
Right. So Dr. Moore releases his 2021 letter, I think May 31. That's made public. And in that letter, he says, I was going to do this myself this year, but I'm decided I won't be at the annual meeting. I'm leaving. And so immediately Grant Gaines and Ronnie Parrott. Grant was a trustee at NAM. So one of the groups, Dr. Moore says, was getting unfair investigation by the executive committee. Grant stands up immediately and says, I'm going to make that motion. Ronnie and I are going to make the motion to investigate the allegations in Dr. Moore's letters. And you could tell between the time Grant says that a few days into June and the annual meeting, somebody gets to him and says, no, let's massage these motions. And in fact, the motion that gets made doesn't reference the letters. The motion before the messengers is to do an investigation of the past, looking back for the past 20 years. We're not going to investigate the future, according to that motion. And it doesn't quite explicitly say the scope would include Dr. Moore's allegations. It just says we're going to investigate abuse and efforts to stymie reform.
Now, Jon, do you have any reason for why you think those letters, which contain such, serious allegations, got sort of tossed aside and it got opened up? You said people got to them, but what's your take on that?
Well, I mean, I think they knew the letters were overstated. The letters were prose intended to start investigation. They didn't want the letters to be investigated themselves. They wanted the focus to be on the executive committee because the goal was to put the executive committee in the hot seat in return. So, and you could tell, someday we do a Mystery Science Theater style review of the 2021 annual meeting. There was lots of skullduggery at the Resolutions Committee with Bart Barber, with the Order of Business Committee with Adam Greenway. everybody on that platform was out to get the executive committee. They were going to let unusual things happen so that the investigation against the executive committee could go forward. You see, in fact, the motion Grant Gaines makes, J.D. Greer is almost helping to make it. So I hear what you want to do is X, Y, and Z. Yes, that's what I want to do. So there was a plan to step aside and let the wave of messenger angst hit the executive committee. Ronnie Floyd, I will never forget the messenger that stood up and said, "Brother Ronnie, as I've seen the allegations, this is my first time at one of these meetings. As I read it, it looks like they're accusing you of sitting on information that should be in law enforcement. Reports should have been made to the police. Is that what, are you aware of any such allegations at the executive committee?" And Ronnie Floyd stands up and he's nervous and he's deer in the headlights. And he says, "No, not that we're aware of. Nothing like that." But that was the effect on the messengers. And the letters were written to have that effect. And I know people can go back and say now, well, I think he was talking about this, or I think he's talking about that. The purpose of the letters and the way they were framed was to produce an angry, emotional response by messengers who read them for the first time. It wasn't meant to be read by the actively always online Southern Baptist community, the Twitter community. The effect of those letters on messengers who attend the annual meeting was they took the response they were intended to have, which was, we cannot trust the executive committee. Whatever they say, we need to prove independently, even if that means hurting the Southern Baptist Convention and the executive committee. So the motion that gets passed is a little ambiguous about how the investigation is supposed to be conducted. There was this committee that was formed, and whether or not they were supposed to waive attorney-client privilege, or the executive committee was supposed to consider waiving attorney-client privilege, was unclear. But the executive committee at the end of the annual meeting said, "We welcome an investigation. An investigation will happen. We'll work with the committee to develop some reasonable parameters and discuss what the best way to get that done was." And there was another motion.
Yeah, go ahead. The Jared one.
Yeah. So there was another motion during the same time, during open business. Jared Longshore, I think, who was in Florida at the time, moved to investigate Dr. Moore's letters. If they were true, why had there not been a report made to law enforcement? And again, this is the reaction messages are having. We've read Dr. Moore's letters. It sounds like something should be reported to the police and wasn't. And there's a culture of things not being reported to the police. So we need to investigate this. Jared Longshore says, well, can the ERLC tell us why Dr. Moore didn't make a report earlier? And under our polity, any motion dealing with an entity automatically stands referred to that entity. And so Jared Longshore's motion is referred to the ERLC. So coming out of the 2021 meeting, messengers were angry. They were blindsided. They couldn't trust the executive committee. They were told they couldn't trust the executive committee. And so then the executive committee is trying to negotiate what's a reasonable response to the request of the messengers. Can we honor this request in a way that does not harm the convention or the executive committee? And then in the fall, ERLC trustees were supposed to meet, and I still had questions after what had happened. Remember, I had received the letter. I had tried to get a board meeting to discuss compensation or a severance package before the annual meeting. I was told that was not necessary and couldn't get trustees to support me in that call. And so the next chance I had to talk about these issues with the RLC trustees was in the fall board meeting. And that year was held at the Opryland Hotel.
Okay, that's helpful backstory. And so to summarize, coming out of the 2021 annual convention, with the letters serving their intended purpose of completely destroying trust in the executive committee, at least among the gathered messengers. And again, inappropriately so. The motion to investigate the claims of Russell Moore and in his letters got referred to the ERLC. So they got tasked with investigating themselves, and yet a broader investigation into the executive committee and many decades of history of potential alleged cover-up in the SBC, that's what got officially launched and tasked to a third party, correct?
Right. In Grant and Ronnie's tweets before the convention, they said, well, the only way to get to the bottom of this, the only way to hear both sides of these letters, of these accusations, is to do an independent investigation. But at the annual meeting, Grant's motion didn't ask for both sides. It just asked for an investigation of the executive committee's wrongdoing, assuming the wrongdoing, and issuing that charge. Jared asked for an investigation of the ERLC allegations in the letter, and that gets sent to the ERLC. Now, you could have made the argument the ERLC shouldn't be trusted to respond to that motion any more than the executive committee. But, the angry mob, the pitchforks are there for the executive committee. And like I said, that was consistent with some goals of other folks on the platform at that time. So they let unusual things happen against the executive committee that they wouldn't let happen against the other entities.
John, on that point, I think it might be helpful, again, to do a little editorializing here. Why were the people in charge and running the show in the 2021 convention, which that was obviously being chaired, run by J.D. Greer? So why did we have this J.D. Greer, Russell Moore, Grant Gaines, and sort of other actors so intent on bringing down the executive committee and leading the messengers with, lack of information at best and wrong information at worst to do this? I mean, at that time, Mike Stone was the chair of the executive committee, correct? And he was running for the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. I mean, was this all just one major attempt to make sure that somebody like Mike Stone did not become the president of the Southern Baptist Convention?
Yeah, especially Mike Stone. There were a confluence of interests, right? So the ERLC was upset that Mike Stone and conservatives were at the executive committee. This came at the same time there was kind of a generational handoff that obviously was handled poorly. But you had lots of young, restless, and reformed, generally guys, the younger, what some would call Calvinist group, spearheaded by J.D. Greer. And that was supposed to be a generational change. And they were chomping at the bit and then chafing against the older traditionalist SBC governance. And so that the last stronghold of that governance was at the executive committee, or at least they thought that was what was standing in their way. So you had entities like Southeastern that had been accused of being woke and talking about critical race theory in its classes. They were upset by the potential of the executive committee. You had Southwestern Seminary with its new president, Adam Greenway. He was upset by his predecessor, Paige Patterson, and Dr. Patterson had been removed under allegations of mishandling and abuse claim. And the executive committee still had friends of Paige Patterson on it who didn't think Patterson had mishandled it in a way that required removal. So they were upset at the executive committee. And so you had kind of this confluence of interest. Southwestern was angry. The ERLC was angry. Southeastern wasn't a big fan. And then you have the abuse advocates that show up very angry about how Patterson and others had handled abuse in the past. And at the same time, you're hearing this story about what happens with Judge Pressler in Texas. This lawsuit is unsealed. And so there's just the perfect storm of people who are anxious to get rid of the executive committee to limit its influence. They really thought they'd be better off without the ability of the executive committee to have oversight of these entities. But in the SBC system, that is the group that's charged with thinking about the whole system in between annual meetings.
Okay,
That's the group that's charged with keeping it all together.
Yeah, that's helpful because I think some other context and actors to bring into this. I think the Paige Patterson point is helpful because at this time, this cadre of individuals, the Southeastern crowd, the J.D. Greer crowd, the Russell Moore crowd, the Greenway crowd, Bart Barber's obviously a part of that, is in sort of meta terms, they are trying to, in some ways, really sort of, purge the last vestiges of conservative resurgence leaders from the Southern Baptist Convention. And I would think because they are now watching the editorials come hot and heavy from New York Times, Atlantic, and outside critics, trying to paint the Southern Baptist Convention as a den of abusers and malcontents. Of course, they're aiding in the prevalence of that narrative by the work that Russell Moore is doing, but all of that could potentially be seen as sort of a cynical ploy to burn it all down and then rule on the ashes and lead us to a different future, a kinder, more Kellerite future, where we're not the racist Southern Baptists, where the Great Commission or Convention or something like that. And that also played into what happened to Mike Stone as he was running when Hannah Kate, a character who was at the microphone with Grant, and then Stone was falsely accused of having, some sort of confrontational conversation with her in which Griffin Gullidge tweeted out, a synopsis of a conversation that he did not himself witness, essentially taking the same play, accused Mike Stone of being unloving towards an abuse victim, and spread that around before the vote. And then, of course, after that first vote in which it came down to a Litton-Stone runoff, the Southeastern crowd immediately threw in behind Litton. And so we come out of that convention with executive committee tarnished, Mike Stone defeated, and now these investigations launched. I hate to say it as we review all of this, but they were wildly successful in their endeavors here, it seems.
And so I think, you're right. I think some people have decided I'm done with the Baptist Convention, and if I can't have it, nobody can. And so they leave and they throw a bomb. We know Beth Moore had already decided to leave in 2020. Russell Moore, I've said, decided to leave in 2020. Philip Bethencourt was out of the ERLC by 2020. So some folks decided, look, we're done trying to reform from the inside. We're going to blow it up. And if it dies, it dies. But instead, it was successful. It in a matter of coincidence, I was about 30 feet from that Mike Stone Hannah Kate conversation. There was a conversation. I didn't notice it being unusual. There was no loud volume, but the allegation that came out of it because of Griffin's social media posting was that Mike Stone had done something wrong in that conversation towards an abuse victim. And now I think Griffin's story probably would have changed because he's had similar conversations where he was in the exact same position, where somebody got upset because of something Griffin said. Griffin doesn't want us to believe that's wrong and immoral, but at the time, the social media posting was, well, Mike Stone has done something to offend an abuse victim, and that makes him a person unqualified to lead in the Southern Baptist Convention. So that was the story they were trying to get out at the point.
Yeah, and I do recall that last year at the annual meeting, there was an effort to get the video footage of that encounter, if possible, which ultimately didn't move forward, didn't happen. But it is, it's a smaller piece of this whole thing, but it's a lingering, point of concern, serious concern in the Southern Baptist Convention that men like Russell Moore and Griffin Gullidge have traded on these slanderous narratives towards Mike Stone and the executive committee, and continue on in Southern Baptist life as if nothing ever happened, which is why we're trying to have this conversation to get to the truth of things. So we come out of let's begin moving on from the 2021 annual convention into the fall, and what really sets the stage for the next continuing 3 years of wandering in the wilderness, being guided by a false narrative on these issues.
So coming out of the convention, then the political move begins to do the most damage we possibly can to the executive committee. It wasn't clear the executive committee what it was going to do. There was still a majority was held by kind of traditional Southern Baptists, kind of what we'd call now the old line or old guard. It wasn't clear what they were going to do. So the effort was made to maximize the pressure to do the most self-harm to the executive committee as it could. And on that point, let me say, I understand the Baptist way is not to pressure somebody to hurt themselves. The Baptist way is to make a request of an entity and then listen to its response. And sometimes that's next year, right? In the normal course of business, the executive or somebody makes a motion, it gets referred to that entity. We hear a response the next year. And if we don't like the response, then we can act. But it's never been the case that Baptists stand at a microphone and make the motion and then say, now you need to shut up and do what we said without a response. We had trustees there to protect the executive committee and the Southern Baptist Convention. And the attitude was, we will not listen to their arguments. We will not let them take a breath and respond over the course of the year. They need to immediately cave and waive attorney-client privilege. Why do lawyers want that? Because that's the maximum damage you can do to the other side. There are no secrets. Whatever your lawyer told you is strong or weak about your case instantly becomes available to the other side. So the lawyers seeking the investigation obviously wanted the executive committee to have to show as much as it could, even if it was damaging to the convention or the executive committee. And if you're over the convention, if you decide it doesn't matter whether the convention lives or dies, then that's fine to you. You want that to happen. And so immediately after the 2021 annual meeting, you start getting networks of often NAM related or Southeastern Seminary related or ERLC related pastors and church planters and denominational folks circulating letters saying, I don't care what the executive committee says. If they don't waive attorney-client privilege at their next meeting, we're going to stop giving into the cooperative program. And those letters would get signed by 20 or 30 convention-related pastors in each state to increase the pressure that if the executive committee doesn't fold, we're going to walk away from the convention. And that ended up being wildly successful. Eventually, the executive committee does fold after I think the number was 30 trustees resigned. Some of them were accountants, and their professional code prohibited them from ignoring a lawyer's advice. Others just said, this is a bad move. We can't accept this. But the end result of the push in the fall was to wipe out, in essence, the 3 prior presidents' appointments and to give J.D. Greer and the current, or at that point it was Ed Litton, to give the current administration, in effect, single-year appointment of the entire executive committee. So they were able to control the executive committee by appointment in a single year that normally should not be able to happen under SBC life. Normally, to make any change, it takes several presidents. That was the lesson of the conservative resurgence. The pushback, the end of the conservative resurgence comes when J.D. Greer gets to appoint suddenly, or Ed Litton gets to appoint suddenly over a third of the executive committee in a single year, effectively shifting control in favor of the political group in the SBC that was most angry about the executive committee having too much authority, they said.
And this is the same Ed Litton, of course, that we would be remiss to mention, who became president. And then within a week of us electing him, we realized that he had a habit of using, at best, prepared sermons, at worst, plagiarized sermons, and even those particularly done by J.D. Greer. And we know that he was using J.D. Greer's sermons, and which created a controversy that was largely ignored by those in power and brushed off, but did ultimately lead to him only serving one term. And so we have 3 years of J.D. Greer and then 1 year of Ed Litton. And it's really interesting the way you put it. And essentially those final 2 years, the last year of Greer and the first year of Litton, they're able to remake the executive committee into the image of this, for lack of a better term, it's an appropriate term, far more liberal and far more progressively minded contingency in the SPC. And so drill down a little bit more there on the departures from the executive committee under the pressure to waive attorney-client privilege. There were many there who were saying this is not the right thing to do. This is not how we exercise our responsibility to steward the Southern Baptist Convention during the year when the annual meeting is not occurring. And so they resigned in protest to this sort of unprecedented move. And you're a lawyer, so help us explain that a little bit, understand that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, at least what was publicly reported was the executive committee hired several rounds of lawyers to advise executive committee members what was best, what way could they find forward. And so obviously the big question is, what do you find out after waiver of attorney-client privilege that you wouldn't find out otherwise? Should you harm the organization by waiving what I call a blanket waiver? Now, that was, people quibbled with that later. Well, it's only 20 years, so that's not a blanket. Most lawyers would say that's a blanket waiver on this topic for 20 years before you know what's in the documents. That looks like just shooting yourself in the foot right out the gate, because who knows what lawyers have said over the years out of context that you could pull out of those documents. So it would be extraordinarily harmful to have a blanket 20-year waiver. And do you need that waiver to find out the facts in this investigation? And ultimately, I think the Guidepost report doesn't rely on anything that was attorney-client privileged about, and there are rules to what's attorney-client privilege. It's not everything a lawyer says. It's everything for the purpose of receiving advice about litigation. And so when you look at what is published in the Guidepost report, I don't see anything. It would be very, very little, if at all, that was actually dependent on attorney-client privilege that advanced the Guidepost investigation, that made it into the Guidepost report. What made it in the Guidepost report were things like Johnny Hunt. That wasn't attorney-client privileged. But in other litigation now, when the Southern Baptist Convention is in other litigation, we have this 20-year hole in the attorney-client privilege that has been blown up. And the problem with that is now it lets insurance companies say, you have voluntarily made the case against you harder for us to defend if there's ever a lawsuit. So when the convention buys insurance to defend lawsuits, we give the right to the insurance company to say, hey, we don't intend to do anything wrong. If we've made a mistake, though, we're going to buy insurance to cover that. And if that's the case, the insurance company gets the right to defend, to appoint a lawyer to defend the convention the best it can. And if the client in that case goes out and tries to make it harder for the insurance company to defend the lawsuit, that breaches the contract in essence. And the insurance company gets to say, no, you can't undermine us as we try to defend. We'll pay whatever's due up to the limits of the policy, but we're not going to pay for the things that you make worse. And so the question the executive committee was facing is, well, do we need to do this to do an investigation of what's been asked? Because if we do this, it may seriously harm our ability to have insurance to pay victims if there's actually a claim against the executive committee. The effect of waiving attorney-client privilege was not only potentially harmful in the investigation, it was permanently harmful to the convention's ability to insure and repay against any claims that resulted during this 20-year period. So that was the problem. The trustees were being asked to permanently harm the executive committee and maybe the rest of the convention by choosing to waive attorney-client privilege. And they didn't want to do that if there was another way to get it done. So they proposed several ways. Why don't we look at the documents first, and then we'll let a third party look at them, and they can decide if there's anything there even material to your investigation. But the networks were already ginned up, and they said, no, nothing but just pure groveling. Nothing but the executive committee shooting itself in the foot will suffice to satisfy the messenger's motion. And ultimately, enough trustees resigned that the motion to waive attorney-client privilege passed. The good news is there was really nothing in those documents that Guidepost complained about, right? There's nothing in the attorney-client privilege portion that added to Guidepost's report. The bad news is we have now, in fact, permanently injured our ability on insurance grounds to defend, and you can kind of see them admitting that in even recent podcasts about, it turns out that had some unintended consequences.
Who admitted that?
The good news is, I think we've seen Adam Wyatt say there's been unintended consequences to waiving attorney-client privilege. Barber did a podcast interview recently with the Baptist Review where he talks about how, as a result of some other things that happened in the Southern Baptist Convention, it has become impossible for the ARC to acquire insurance for a database. And the only way they could do that is to go outside the convention to try to acquire insurance. They don't actually have it yet, from what I understood him to say, but if it was going to have any hope at all, they had to go outside the convention, which tells me, reading the tea leaves, that the convention is in not just a normal bad situation, right? It's not just that the database would incur some liabilities. It's that the convention has a uniquely bad position on insurance. And I would guess that's due to the waiver of attorney-client privilege.
And so to summarize that, we gave into these demands, and the ask to waive attorney-client privilege was something that was held out there, obviously, from the culture of distrust that was created by everything else we've covered here, the letters, the audio, the motions. And they did it, lost a ton of people who had been working hard and giving their time to help steward the Southern Baptist Convention in the process. We got essentially a new class of ideologues and activists appointed by the Litton Greer wing of the SBC to take over the executive committee. And we found nothing. We got nothing out of it positive. Well, I guess positively, though this hasn't been admitted, it sounds like we know now that these allegations were false. We know that, and yet we have permanently damaged the Southern Baptist Convention's institutional ability to operate and to procure insurance. And it's even had downstream effects on these abuse reforms. Not that you or I think that the ARC is a good proposal or a path forward, but it is ironic to note that some of the problems that they're having are immediately downstream from the actions that their wing of the SBC brought about on the convention.
Yeah, I think even in their podcast, one of the hosts says, in back rooms, people are now agreeing that what the old guard told us was right, that the old leadership that we fired for supposedly mishandling and not acting correctly, they were right about liability and insurance concerns. They were trustworthy. After we decided we could not trust them, they were trustworthy. The world of the executive committee, the world of the Guidepost report looks nothing like Russell Moore's letters. There was no culture of hiding abuse or molestation at the executive committee uncovered in the Guidepost report. There was the widespread idea that the convention had mishandled abuse, but when you pressed Barber about that under oath, the mishandling the things he says were actually mishandled were the Jen Lyle situation and the executive committee staff and lawyers refused to answer Krista Brown's phone calls. And they went on to say, so that was a $6 million investigation. And they've said, well, maybe the $6 million was worth it because, that's just life because the executive committee lost our trust. Well, no, the reason the executive committee lost trust was the mob that was spun up. And lots of these people in power now were part of the mob. And as I've told people, in so many ways, it was fraudulent. There's a couple of ways to be fraudulent with your promises to the public. And I realize this is politics. And so, what are you going to do when the candidates defraud you? But you can be fraudulent by telling somebody a lie that there's a knowing lie. But you can also be fraudulent by making reckless promises. And so the way people got into office was to promise, I'm different than the guys before. The guys before you can't trust, but you can trust me because I will get it done. And that's reckless. They had no idea. In fact, they were warned, no, you can't get it done. The insurance reality is you can't get it done. And now those very same folks that said, you can trust me to get it done, are now admitting to each other, actually, the old guys were right. I knew about the warnings, and we spent $6 million after we called somebody untrustworthy, only to find out, they were mostly trustworthy. They called us. They didn't call somebody back we wish they would have called back, and they mishandled the Jen Lyle thing. But otherwise, their warnings about financial liability were correct. And so it's kind of like, if somebody's injured on an airplane and they stand up and say, is there a doctor in the house? And one doctor stands up and says, yes, I'm a doctor. And then somebody else stands up and goes, I don't think you can trust that person. It'd be better if you let me do this. I think I can do it. Not knowing whether you could do it or not, but just because you didn't like that guy, you just want the credit. It was so fraudulent to promise abuse victims that this team knew better. They didn't know better. They were warned that they couldn't get it done. And now that they can't get it done, they've kind of written it off as, well, that's the price our enemies paid for not being trustworthy. People should be livid that the Southern Baptist Convention had to spend upwards of $6 million, $7 million, $8 million to investigate a claim of untrustworthiness, only to get rid of the trustees at the executive committee, to permanently hurt the convention's ability to defend lawsuits or pay victims who've actually been damaged by the convention. And yet people want to stay in power because they say, well, whoops, that's just life. It's just astounding, the kind of moral calculus that has been done to justify a political play, when in fact the investigation revealed that in fact the liability concerns and insurance concerns were about right.
Yeah, that is staggering. And the question that remains is, what, if anything, can be done to get accountability for those who have defrauded the Southern Baptist Convention? And then what can be done going forward, which we want to get into that for sure. What is the answer here? You and Josh Abatoy wrote about that some in the article for Center for Baptist Leadership on the path forward on abuse reforms. But this has to be a key piece of it, is that we need the messengers. We need pastors to understand what has really happened over the last 4 years in the Southern Baptist Convention that led us to this point today. And I mean, I would say that we need some people to resign and take accountability for it. I doubt we'll see that happen, but it really is astounding, and it's disheartening, and it's not at all the narrative that people know and has gotten any traction in the media. I can't think of a single investigatory reporting piece that talks about, a conspiracy to defraud the Southern Baptist Convention for political revenge. But that's essentially what we've been talking about here today. So, Jon, what's the path forward on this? What does accountability look like? What should pastors and messengers do? What should our leaders do? I mean, let's be frank and let's be clear. Before the Lord, and to tell the truth, what would actual repentance and restoration and accountability look like on these issues for us?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, I think some people do need to apologize and resign if they were part of the mob, right? If you were part of the mob that in effect hurt the Southern Baptist Convention, if you're in power because you were warned in advance about the potential concerns and went into office just to get rid of the old guys, right? But just because you're angry at investigation or questions being asked by the old guys, the convention has to get rid of those people. Or that that is a cancer to good governance. The convention has to hold people responsible for the promises they make. And if somebody goes into office saying they will produce a certain result and in fact are dishonest about what they know, are dishonest about the results they produce, and then come back to you and say, actually, you're right, the old guys were right, and we can't do this. Those are not people exercising good, independent judgment. So they need to be replaced with trustees that are going to be open and transparent and accountable. And that's why Josh and I wrote about Baptist accountability. There has to be some accountability between the entities and the messengers. That doesn't mean the messengers just get to order the entities around. There's going to be discussion. There's going to be response. There's a Baptist system worked out. But ultimately, the trustees have to be accountable to the messengers. And if trustees are making fraudulent promises to victims about the results they're going to obtain, or the difference between them and the old guys, or spreading rumors that the leaders are untrustworthy, when in fact they weren't untrustworthy, when in fact after you've studied everything, you come to the same conclusion. We need trustees that can be accountable to the convention. And that's step one. We need to be able to say no to what are in essence political moves. It is not lost on me that sometimes reform is only brought up when it looks like there might be a conservative gaining ground. So every year we get some story about, well, we're just minutes away from the database. And then we get a website that looks like it took 10 minutes to put up. And that's only raised when conservatives say, well, maybe this isn't, there's no forward progress. It sure looks like some of this has been used as a political tool. I'm glad to see, I guess, in essence, that they've said now it just can't be done inside the convention. We've run this to ground, and there's no more viable way for this to occur. But the convention at some point does need to say, well, this charade of politics needs to stop. We need to admit if there are churches that are undertrained, if there are churches that need help in policies, if there are churches that need help in communication, the convention is already equipped to do that. But this idea about eternal investigatory tribunals that churches will be required to use, in essence, the convention providing judgment over local churches, that's not Baptist. It's not healthy. It will never lead to health. And those kinds of solutions need to be rejected. Yeah.
So you mentioned people that maybe need to resign. Is there anybody in particular you want to name here? If not, that's fine. But maybe also then what would it look like for any actual accountability to be held for this long and sordid history of malfeasance? I was speaking to one former executive committee member a while back, and he was saying that the messengers need to essentially force a vote to vacate the entire executive committee and replace it in toto, or to vacate everybody who's still on the executive committee that voted to waive attorney-client privilege. I mean, is that something that can be done? Can there be more discrete actions taken to hold particular people accountable? What can Southern Baptists do here?
I guess my primary interest is getting us on the right path as fast as we can before I'm too concerned about meting out justice in the past. If called on a commission to talk about what that looked like, or a committee was named, then maybe I'd spend more thought about that. My goal now for Southern Baptist life is to get us back to healthy as fast as we can. That means putting trustees that are accountable. That means messengers holding trustees accountable. That means rejecting the false narrative that there's going to be substantial reform of the denominational machinery because of sexual abuse failures. There were no failures. And as I understand Mark Barber and others to say now, they've given up there's any hope of reforming the denominational machinery, whether or not they thought it needed to be. So we need to tell each other the truth and return to health. And unfortunately, that probably means lots of new leaders in lots of new places.
Lots of new leaders in lots of new places. Well, we certainly have an opportunity to elect a new leader this June in Indianapolis, and there will be downstream effects of that. The executive committee is obviously still in its search for a permanent CEO, and it seems like there's been a name that has come to the top here.
Dr. Orge, yeah.
Dr. Orge.
Jeff Orge.
Jeff Orge. So if Jeff Orge asked you, what should I do when I take over the executive committee, if he's the next one, what would you tell him?
Well, like a lawyer, I'd say it depends. But he's probably got lots of things to think about. But step one is tell the truth. Tell the truth to the people. Let's get rid of the false narratives. Let's start doing what's right. And let's not be worried so much about our reputation. Our reputation matters insofar as we're doing the right thing. But if it's hard to do the right thing, we need to do the right thing.
So tell the truth. That's obviously the first step. And then what should be done at the convention going forward on institutional level efforts for abuse reform in the Southern Baptist Convention? Should we wind down ARITF? Should we stand up the ARC? What should we do here? What can we do here? Because it seems like the ARC is being proposed in such a way as it's outside the reach of accountability to Southern Baptist messengers. So is this something that's going to happen whether we like it or not? What should messengers be willing to do and looking to do in June this year?
Well, so we have now had 3 different abuse groups. ARC would be the 4th. The 3rd group has been given access to just under $2 million by Send Relief, NAM, and IMB. And right before the announcement of ARC, or concurrent with the announcement of ARC, ARITF's leaders said, well, we've really run out of things to do inside the convention. We're going to have to take this whole enterprise outside the convention. And they suggested they would be taking the $2 million with them to their new organization outside the convention. And NAM and Send Relief and IMB said, no, that was not the agreement. They pretty quickly issued a press release and said no. Dr. Barber, in his most recent podcast with Baptist Review, said he's not sure there's going to be any recommendation to vote on from ARITF this summer. Meaning ARITF, it's not clear if they plan to disband or if they just plan to continue. As I have written, I think once you admit there's no viable path forward for reform inside the convention, you shouldn't stick around and try to spend up Send Relief money just because it's there. If there's no viable path forward, then that group needs to go ahead and wind things up and shut down so that the money can go towards meaningful activity, not just towards keeping a committee on life support. As I've said in an article with Josh and I think there are things like curriculum and policies and I think it's been called a toolkit, and some of those ideas are great. They weren't $10 million necessary. We didn't need a guidepost investigation to do better policies, but I think those should stick around. What's interesting is ARC seems to be saying they're going to take those policies with them, and they will do the toolkit and curriculum development. I'm not sure how you could take SBC material with you to your new group, and suddenly then you're in charge of selling it. So there'd have to be some question there. The convention, the sustained focus on this issue has produced some good tools, and I hope those are still available to churches. We don't need to restructure the convention to make use of those tools. Between Lifeway and ERLC and the executive committee and the seminaries, there's lots of teaching capacity, lots of curriculum capacity, lots of research capacity. We don't need to farm that out to ARC. So ARITF, it's not clear they're going to bring a recommendation. If they have no path forward, I'd suggest it's appropriate they wind down. Messenger could bring that recommendation this summer as well. With ARC, I know the corporation has been formed in South Carolina. So many legal questions about whether this is going to work. Dr. Barber on Baptist Review said there are no obstacles that have not already begun to fall. Well, that means the obstacles are still up. There's still lots of insurance obstacles and legal obstacles going forward to this entity being able to do even what they say they want to do. And at this point, given the way it has been sold as an independent organization from the SBC, and in fact, they've said the entire structure depends on it being separate from the SBC. We can't get insurance unless it's separate from the SBC. It makes absolutely no sense for the SBC then to say, well, yeah, that's our baby, right? That's our child. Well, but the whole idea was for it to not be the convention's child. It's not clear to me what lawyers have advised them on how to make their public pitch, but it sure seems to me like they've destroyed the argument about it being separate. And so if it's not really separate, it's not clear it's going to work, as they've already said. I have serious questions about whether that's viable or not. And for now, I can't recommend anybody in good conscience try to donate money to a cause it's not clear they're going to be able to accomplish.
Well, that's a helpful summary of the situation, John. And I think that that's something that messengers do need to keep in mind as we go into June. I think you're right. It's time to wind down ARITF and to raise serious questions about the viability of ARC. What's the status of these potential databases? Because that's something that I know that you have spoken to and crossed rhetorical swords with Matt and Martins on before, the idea of whether that was in-house in the SBC or this new independent organization compiling lists of credibly accused individuals, but not meeting legal standards. I liked how you said in the article for Center for Baptist Leaderships that, courts don't have commercial competitors because this is not something that independent non-judicial bodies should be taking on. I mean, that's why I have used the phrase Politburo to describe this effort going, repeatedly, because if they're going to be investigating and putting people's names on lists and perhaps making mistakes, this is going to happen in some sort of permanent and unaccountable fashion going forward. It does sound a little bit like a Politburo to me within the SBC, but what's the status of those databases and how does that play with this new organization?
Yeah, as far as I can tell now, there are no databases. One was, a mock-up of one was put up that looked like it had taken a half hour or so with a web designer to put up, but it's gone now. And so we just have a page that says, see here for, a database in the future. It's not clear to me what the ARC thinks it will actually accomplish with respect to databases. It looks like they may just be limiting themselves to criminal convictions or confessions or judgments. So either the law holds you responsible or you've confessed clearly, but that's all that ARC is promising to put in the database ever. As you pointed out, it's criminal courts. There are services that will decide, private arbitrators will decide if you've breached a contract. Nobody goes out and decides by arbitrator if you've committed murder or if you've committed a rape. But yet that is what at one point ARITF was suggesting, that we would have outside legal experts give us private opinions about whether sex laws were violated in a criminal fashion. And I'm not sure who would ever do that, who would give that opinion, or if you were a victim, why you would let somebody do that for you, right? If you thought somebody had raped you, you would not go get an advisory opinion from the church people about whether or not the law was broken. You would take that to a jury, because the only thing that could happen is the private guy could muck it up and say, well, no, there was no rape here. Say, no, I was actually raped. I'm going to take that to the jury. Thank you very much. I'm not sure why it would help victims to have private tribunals in that fashion. I'm not sure how it would help churches to have it, but that was the plan, was to have private tribunals about criminal law. And as I think now they have understood, that's not economically, insurably feasible. It's highly legally risky to engage in those kinds of judgments, because if you get it wrong about sex crimes, that's going to be an expensive judgment to pay. And so it's not clear to me if ARC thinks it's going to get into that business eventually or not. All the more reason not to be closely associated with it, because you can't assess what kind of risk they're about to take on.
That's helpful. Yeah, that's a really good point, John. Well, we've been at this across what will become what is a series of podcasts on this episode, on these issues within the Southern Baptist Convention for a few hours now. So let's try to bring this to a close and leave our listeners with a clarified understanding of what really happened these many years ago now that led to the point we're at. And so let me try to summarize that, and then you can make sure to add any additional clarifying information. And so when we go back, of course, to the 2017 Houston Chronicles reports, and then the beginning of attempts to address this or look into it. And then we get to 2020, where Russell Moore drafts this letter that reveals quite a state of mind that he's in regarding the Southern Baptist Convention, that gets delivered to the Ethics and Religious Liberties Commission trustee board, but just the executive committee of the trustee. But then it gets leaked publicly. It has these crazy allegations. You try to explore that with the committee and with David Prince, and you're rebuffed. And ultimately, we're told that he got over it, but he clearly didn't get over it, as he was attempting to plant a seed of destruction in advance of the 2020 annual convention that was postponed due to COVID. And so we get the second letter in May of 21, right before the annual convention's meeting. And then we get the leaked audios, and they whip the crowd up into a frenzy of distrust towards the executive committee. And we remember that we think so much of what was driving that was an act of politically motivated revenge on the executive committee for investigating, or really asking some basic questions about his leadership of the ERLC, which had come under increasing scrutiny because of the way he was carrying himself as a public figure. But he was successful in creating that atmosphere of distrust within the messenger body towards the executive committee. And so there were investigations launched coming out of the 2021 annual meeting further pressure put on the executive committee to waive attorney-client privilege. A whole host of people who left the executive committee and now have been replaced with loyalists to the Greer, Litton, Moore wing of the SBC. And here we are now today, and those loyalists are realizing they made promises they couldn't keep, and the things that the previous leadership of the executive committee were telling them, there is no culture of abuse here, there is no abuse cover-up, and if you do these things, it won't help victims, it will only hurt the convention, has turned out to be true. And as it stands today, you haven't, I trust, gotten any more clarity or closure from the leadership of the ERLC about how they dropped the ball so tragically on, exercising oversight over Russell Moore during his time there. Is that correct?
Yeah. So, the last I talked to them about this issue was in the fall of 2021, and I went up to two members of the executive committee to ask them, if you received letters in 2020 and thought they didn't require your action because for whatever reason, he was just angry or he would get over it, don't you think that's something the executive committee and the Southern Baptist Convention should know as they're assessing how to respond? And Dr. Prince told me, I don't think the convention voted based on the letters. And I didn't find that to be credible, frankly. I was astounded at that answer. But shortly after that, the ERLC took up Jared Longshore's motion, which called for an investigation. And very cleverly, the recommendation was to agree to cooperate in any investigation of the ERLC, knowing that the Guidepost motion didn't call for an investigation of the ERLC, and Guidepost wouldn't investigate ERLC. So they agreed to participate in an investigation they didn't believe would ever come. And at that point, that cleared me to write the executive committee and Guidepost with what I understood about the deception surrounding these letters and Dr. Moore's relationship with the executive committee. And that was eventually reported by Lonnie Wilkie in the Tennessee Baptist Convention's newspaper about the letter that I had sent. And that's kind of how some of that became public.
Well, thank you for your work on this, Jon. This is so important. And the point here is, it's not to throw mud, it's to speak the truth. And there are few people positioned across the entirety of the Southern Baptist Convention who know more about what's happened here than you do. So on behalf of those who love the truth and desire health in the Southern Baptist Convention, thank you so much for taking the time to tell us this story. And I'll give you sort of the closing word here. What, again, do you hope would come out of all of this?
Yeah, I mean, I thank you for that. Obviously, it is a matter of making a record about what really happened. Some will say this is just Baptist history, but we still have not recovered from what happened in 2020 and 2021. At least $6 million, probably far more than that, 10 or 15 or $20 million of offering plate money has been spent on lawyers and consultants and investigators because of the frenzy created by the letters. And so if the convention is going to get healthy, it has to understand what happened, how people manipulated the process to waste so much money on what amounted to pretty selfish concerns by leadership. There are real abuse victims in the SBC, in local churches. They need the help that the convention could provide, but so much money was wasted on political vendettas that didn't go to help abuse victims. I just think Baptists should know and should respond accordingly.
Well, thank you for that. That's exactly right and well said. Thank you for joining us, Jon, on these inaugural episodes of the Baptist Leadership Podcast. Thank you for serving on our advisory board and your service to the broader convention as a trustee at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission.
Thanks, William.
The Center for Baptist Leadership Podcast is powered by American Reformer, hosted by William Wolfe, with audio production by Jared Cummings. Our music is a custom remix of Soldiers of Christ in Truth Arrayed, the official hymn of Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. To help CBL reform and revitalize Christian institutions, please consider making a generous donation today at centerforbaptistleadership.org.